When we started the journey of creating this brand, this category did not exist. Our thesis was that the first 8 years are the most important. About 80% of who you become gets determined then. Yet, the wallet share of spends from parental perspective in the early learning space is less than 5-6%. So that was the insight that we started the journey with. The second insight that we had was, in spite of early learning being so important, you did not have a brand which was known for learning per se. You had toy brands, you had Fun School, you had a Lego, but there was no learning brand. That's the white space that was very interesting to us, and that's how we started. But from a concept perspective, because this category did not exist, so it was not one of those cases where we were already looking for this. In our case, we had to build the category from scratch. So the first step for us was to validate the idea. Is there really a market opportunity for something like this, or is it just in our heads and there's no real market for this? So what we started with was trial packs. We started with a broad age group of 4 to 8 year old children. And then we pitched the pain point to parents. We said, look, you know that your child is capable of so much, but there aren't enough tools at home to help children realize their potential. And this is what we give you, and this is what it will cost you. So very, very simple pitch, which we used at Facebook. We created a bunch of creatives, which just focused on the pain point and how we are solving it and encouraging people to buy a trial pack, right? So when you come to our website, there isn't a catalog. You just buy one trial pack. And so thought process was, let's validate how much traffic are we getting? What is the CTR? How much traffic do we get on our website? How many are proceeding to the click button, which gave us a point of view around whether there was a market for this or not. In the first 3-4 months, it was clear that the data told us that there was a pretty strong demand for this. And the next step then for us was to raise institutional capital. Right? We had started with some seed money that Karthik and I had pulled together. But once we had validated, we had convinced ourselves that this was worth our time. Once we had validated that this is what we want to do for the next several years, the next step was to go raise our seed round, which we did. And that enabled us to start kind of building the product portfolio. A little bit of a chicken and egg situation, because unless you have products, you cannot sell them. Unless you have money, you cannot build product. So what we did was start selling subscriptions and charge money upfront for products that would get delivered. And there were two reasons for doing this. One, we wanted to be seen not as a impulse purchase, just to keep your child busy over a weekend, but more as a learning program. And that required some sort of a commitment upfront where you see this as a learning program. Therefore, you're signing up for 6 months, 7 months, whatever the duration is. So that was the next step. We moved away from the trial model to subscriptions. That took off. And we then raised Series A, Series A, and so on. As we started kind of growing this, we realized that this call that we took, while it worked at a certain level of scale, at the next level of scale, this model led to extremely high CACs. So while we got to the first 1.5, 2 crores a month, we then realized that going beyond that with a model like this would be super expensive. There were two key learnings. One, we saw that anyone who's even bought a single product from us, there was a 50 to 60% chance that they would come back and buy products for another 6 months. That, right? And second, if you are trying to sell a subscription upfront, to win the customer trust when you're an unknown brand is not easy. What if you are a fly-by-night operator who takes the money and doesn't deliver it? So your entire sales and marketing framework, we had to set it up to deal with that risk. So we had a marketing team and we had a sales team on top of marketing. You use marketing to drive traffic to the website. And then you had the sales team who would then talk to those customers, answer questions, give them confidence that you're not going to run away. But what that did was, at the next level of scale, it made the CACs unsustainable because you had a marketing cost and a sales cost. So the next call that we took was, to a new customer, we will not sell a subscription. We will allow them to buy only a single box, max 2 boxes. Once they have experienced that, you would then go and talk to them for a longer term program. That one decision very dramatically changed the contours of our business. This single box was priced only at 500 rupees. The conversion rate shot up very significantly, right? 5-6%. And we made sure that the hero products were out there in terms of the first purchase that people make. For the same amount of marketing spend, now we had 5-6 times more number of customers as before. Very simple. It's just elasticity. It did multiple things. One, it allowed us to reduce CAC. It brought in a lot more customers into the fold. Three, it also ended up improving the gross margin. Because when you are selling a single product versus say 3 products or 5 products, there is a slight discount you need to give to customers for them to buy a product or a 5 product, right? So then have enabled us to change the unit economics of new customer acquisition. Some of this, of course, coincided with COVID hitting and offline business taking a full shutdown and all of that, it was very clear that customers loved the brand, trusted the brand. In fact, we saw record LTRs with our products. We also realized that if you look at what a child does outside of school, Magic Crate is one of the things that the child does. The child goes to a music class, to a chess class, perhaps coding now, which is flavor of the season. The moot point being there are 8, 10 things outside of the kit which the child does. We had earned that trust and that right to ask customers to spend more money with us. The next question was, how do we open up and acquire LTR by getting into more learning formats and more categories? So instead of just being experiential learning, we moved into being, and from just being STEM based, we opened up courses in chess, music, coding, martial arts, sports, fitness, and so on. This is also the time when tech is booming. You had a bunch of startups trying to do exactly this, and you had the established players now growing into this segment. The problem is the CACs are high. Again, not because of our approach, just because the market is overheated, right? There's too much money chasing customer dollars. Right? So the next logical thing for us was, is there a different way by which we can acquire customers? Of course, you have Facebook, you have digital marketing, but is there a different way by which you can qualify customers? And by qualifying customers, I mean their intent and the ability to pay, which is where we opened up this approach of working with offline players. There are different ways by which you can qualify your customers. Then you talk to those customers, enable them to experience the programs for free or at a very subsidized price, the first few classes, and then pitch for a paid conversion. That's how the whole thing evolved. And to kind of differentiate ourselves from pure online players, we kind of started offering blended programs. So you get the kit, you get the online classes, you have the flexibility of switching between programs and all of that. Of course, parents are worried about too much online and they need some amount of offline, whatever that may be. So that's how the business model acquisition works. This happened, of course, over years.
From a website perspective, the critical thing is focus on the message. Even if they spend 30 seconds on the website, what should they get? That's number one. Number two is, do you have every part of your funnel in a way that you can measure each piece and the outcome? And the third one is constantly iterate. You should be simultaneously testing out multiple variants to see which one is working, what is working better, and hence, what do I keep tweaking? Very often, when you think about A/B testing, people take very minor pieces and tweak it. In the early stages, I would say you should be testing major pieces. For example, we tested price points on the website, and we tested all the way from 250, 300 rupees till about 700, 800 to see what ends up happening at different price points and what is the price elasticity. The mistake that we have done very frequently is, in the angst to get the website live, we would launch it without the metrics or the testing parameters in place. Invariably, the entire period is wasted because you have no data that's usable from that period. Let's say the website has been running for 3 days. You spent about a lakh of marketing. You got results, but there's no usable data from it. So net, you've not achieved anything that you want to achieve. Of course, you got your sales. But early on, you're not really playing for sales. You're really trying to understand what are the small things which really matter.
Maintain a logbook. Before you roll out an experiment, you call out and say, this is what I'm testing and this is what qualifies as success. Because often we have our data, but when we go back and look at what were we testing at that point in time, just having a written down saying, this is what we tried, this was the intent, this is what we qualified as success, and this is what happened, allows you to keep playing around till you get to a working model. Because some years later, when some things don't work, you want to go back and see why you did something in a certain way.
From payment gateway, anything related to digital marketing, website perspective, I would say start with references, because when you go in and start taking pitches from providers, you'll end up getting confused on what are you really looking for. So always start with references, find out how they work. And almost everything works perfectly on paper. You're looking for what are the glitches, what happens if something goes down, how quick are they to turn around when issues pop up, and so on. That's point number one. Point number two is almost nowhere should you sign up for anything which is license or upfront payment or give me money for the next 12 months, 6 months, because I'll give you a discount. Nothing. Just pay for monthly, because your requirements just change so dramatically that what you signed up for almost makes no sense even a month later. And you're stuck with the service which you're paid for. You don't want to walk away from it, so you end up with a suboptimal answer. So pay as you go, even if it's more expensive. And almost iteratively keep reevaluating vendors every, let's say, 6 months to see if they are still the best provider for your needs. Because very often your needs keep changing. Very early on, you may ask for a provider who's very dynamic, who's able to make a lot of changes. But as the business matures, you want a very stable provider who's capable of giving you sustained service. They may not be the most fancy guys. They may not have a very brilliant new age API, but they just work and it works really well. Of course, constantly keep checking on your pricing because there's always opportunity. The market is very dynamic. So you always want to keep evaluating the prices and whether that's the best price.
In delivery, company X could be the largest, highest volume, lowest turnaround time, and so on. But if they are bad at the area that you are focused on, that doesn't help you. So understand where your business is coming from and then evaluate very closely against what is that vendor's capability in that certain area. The second thing is with supply chain, there is no end to how much you can optimize. You can keep getting better at it. Again, this is not something which you can figure out at scale. You got to do it from day one and set it up. For instance, in our case, when we ship to subscription customers, when they buy for the first time, our boxes go by air because it needs to reach them possibly the same day or the next day. But when we are sending our monthly packages, there is no reason why it should go by air. So it goes by surface because there is a committed date by which it should reach the customer. Therefore, you have the ability to pre-plan that. You can pay less for that. Each business is different. So figure out what are the advantages that your model gives you and be clear about which customer you're catering to. The early stages, because there isn't usually a lot of capital available, your tendency is to go to the guy who's quoting the lowest. Now he's probably VC funded, trying to build his own market, so he may not be around when you're scaling. So cost should not be your only criteria. It's very important that you look at ability for that vendor to scale up with you.
Especially in digital marketing, I think the market is super shallow in terms of quality of talent. The core aspect which ends up coming missing is they end up being purely digital guys with no understanding of marketing. They think I can just put a set of words together, bundle it with an image, and it'll work. So getting a good high quality digital marketing guy who understands marketing, has an understanding of how to do A/B testing, images, words, combination. Because if you think about it, from a customer's perspective, the flow has to happen. For example, I see an ad, a certain promise from a brand. When I click the button and visit the website, if even the color layout and the words that are being used on the website are jarring, different from what I saw on the ad, it leads to a bounce. So it has to flow from there. Your color palette, the fonts, the look and feel, if possible, even the imagery that is borrowed from the ad onto the website, all of these improve your chances of reducing a bounce or eliminating a bounce. That's point number one. The second part, from a digital marketing perspective, is only two factors. What is the cost of my traffic and what converts? Right? But there are lots of nuts and bolts in between. A lot of digital marketing guys are not good at that. So they prefer to stay at the high level on the ads, inventory, Facebook, Google, and so on, and don't want to get into the website. To get this right, you actually need almost all these pieces functioning. You want your ad to work, your landing page to work, the messaging has to be right, then the entire flow has to work. Now, let's say it's a lead generation, then you want your sales team to use the same pitch when they're calling the customer. Otherwise, you end up with a jarring answer. The flow is the critical part. Now, from a hiring perspective, I would say, honestly, we've not been able to still find a good digital marketing, despite being in the market for about 6 years. We have tested various combinations, but unfortunately, I don't think we have gotten the perfect mix. When I broaden hiring beyond digital marketing, the way we have done this is early on, we looked for a lot of generalists, people who could don a single hat and play multiple roles, meaning they could be marketing guys who understand a little bit of technology, an operations guy who's good at procurement, and so on. But over a period of time, we have had specialists for different roles. Unfortunate reality is a lot of your early hires will not make the transition. And early on, we had a lot of hangups around letting go of some of these people because they were not making the transition. But that is the reality of how the business operates. You will start with generalists. You would attempt to transition some of them into specialist roles, but not everybody makes the transition. In those cases, you kind of part ways.
The other overarching point is the needs of the business change once you have reached product market fit. You are looking at sales and marketing. That's the most important thing to focus on. It makes sense to prioritize that ruthlessly. It just does not mean increasing budgets in terms of hiring for sales and marketing, but also cutting down budget at other places so that you can feed this. That is a call which is not very intuitive, because what got you till here does not necessarily take you from here to the next level, right? That's a mistake that we have done ourselves. Some of the changes that we did in the org structure, we should have done them earlier, right? And in some cases, 6 months earlier, because when the context of business changes, you got to very quickly take a top-down view to say, this is the most important, and this is where I'm going to invest, and this is where I'm going to cut. Because capital is a precious commodity. There is a glut in the market today, but that's not going to be the case forever, right? So at an Uber level, it's also important around finding out what those inflection points are. That context switching becomes a little difficult for founders because they have come through that journey, and that has gotten them there. Seeking product market fit, there is no better way to do it than to be talking to customers. So in our case, the product that we sent to customers, we had very minute data around each activity. So lowest level of detail, we asked customers to rate those products, right? And because we are talking to these customers directly, they were very happy to share that feedback with us. And that's the way we built up this full product portfolio. Just picking up the phone and talking to these customers, that gives you a lot more insight than what months of data can give. It's not like you have to do this exercise across 1,000 people. You pick 10, 15 customers, you will find that that pattern repeats. Solve that problem for those 10, 15 guys, you have solved the same problem for 1,000 other guys, right? So that's what D2C enables you to do. What it gives you is that customer intimacy, where you're able to story tell about your brand. Very importantly, customers are telling you several things about the way that experience is shaping up for them, which then gives you a lot of pointers around, which then forms the crux for how the product evolves, how the brand evolves, how your communication strategy evolves, and all of that. Your ability to talk to those customers, interview those customers, that no other mechanism gives you, right? Now, that's one of the big reasons why D2C companies are able to get to product market fit faster.
When we started the business, we started it as a DIY kids activity box business. Your natural thought process at that point of time is the mothers who are enthusiasts, who really want to sit at home, want to do a lot of things with their children, the alpha moms, they would be your customers. Now, the reality is within almost 2 months, we figured out that they hate our products, right? And they hate our products because, number one, the product is cut and dry. It is meant for a parent who can get this done in about 45 minutes. And there is no ambiguity in how you do it. This is not open-ended play. And third is they would go to the market and buy all the products and put it together and completely discount the whole thing, the time that it takes to put it together. It's almost like my mom saying that food at home is cheaper than restaurant. Of course it's cheaper, right? Because you've discounted the entire effort that goes behind it. But we got to this insight almost in 2 months, because all we had to do was give the product to a few of mothers and fathers who fit that prototype. We tested it out and they came back and they said, we absolutely don't like the product because of A, B, C, D. Now, instead of saying, okay, fine, let's figure out how to solve for it, we just said, okay, they are not our customers. Let's put them aside. Let's talk about the time-pressed parents who have just 45 minutes an hour to spend with their child over the weekend, and they want to do something productive. They don't want to sit and research on the internet. They want to open a box and get it done. Now that customer is willing to pay. There is a need for it, and hence he fits what we are really looking for. Now, I think this insight would have taken a lot longer if we had gone down, for example, trying to do this on Amazon, because on Amazon, you're essentially testing and validating everything based on sales. You don't know the customer. You don't know what kind of mold they fit into. And from sales, it's very hard to backward track and figure out what is working, what is not working.
This is a very important lesson that Karthik and I have learned. Don't be afraid to move away from your original idea to something which is in the sidelines of what you're trying to do, but which is a much larger market opportunity. Don't be too wedded to what you're trying to do. Basis your own conviction. There could be something which is hidden in plain view, which is a much big opportunity than your original opportunity. The experiments have to be run in the early stages to figure out what is that big opportunity, which makes a lot of sense. You're starting with a very small audience, solving a problem for them, and then you are growing from that into a much larger company. So this is a search for product market fit and a larger market. So therefore, as you are going through this product market fit, you are going to see multiple things which possibly are worthwhile to explore and being open to that. So often during the early stages, it's your conviction which got you to a certain point. But that same conviction could come in the way of you pivoting to a larger opportunity. This is something which Karthik and I have realized. For instance, the online services market is a much larger market than the experiential learning market. But the experiential learning, when put together with online, is a much better combination, value proposition to customers, because it's blended learning. So that's how we got there. Could we have gotten there earlier? Possibly. What does that require? It just requires brute force honesty with yourself. And it's not easy, especially when there is a board and you're committed to a board saying, I'm going to grow 10% month on month and so on. And you're constantly trying to grow. You may know that it's not working. And in which case, I think it makes sense to just have that open, honest conversation with the board to say, no, I'm not going to get to 10% because I'm not yet there. This is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to get there. Of course, the board has to play its role in terms of being supportive and not just pushing for growth month on month. Fireside does that beautifully, right? It knows when to pull back.
Early stages, the hardest part is actually figuring out how large is the pie, and is the pie worthwhile going after. And when I say pie, I'm not necessarily talking just about product or space, but even, for example, a distribution channel. Let's say you say, I want to use Facebook. How far will Facebook take you? And when will you plateau? It's extremely hard to predict this because it is just not dependent on you. It's dependent on the market. It's dependent on your competition. And that determines what really happens. One of the pieces which we struggled for the first 3-4 years is to predict the size of the pie and how long do you think it will take you. For example, is the activity box a 5 crore opportunity, a 50 crore opportunity, a 500 crore opportunity? And what do others believe? What do investors believe? That is number one. And this is a place where early entrepreneurs will have a lot of assessing it, especially when it's a new market, purely because it's a new market. To an extent, entrepreneurs are optimists. So they will always take the optimistic view of what a market size is. But you need to constantly kind of balance this by talking to others, investors, just random public, and say, how many people do you think will buy a product like this? It's not that you're kind of overnight shutting down your business and moving out, but you're constantly judging how far will this last? If I continue going down this path, how far will this last? The second piece, which is partly learning from Magic Crate, partly learning from my previous venture, early stage is something which starts to fail, will only get worse over time. It'll never improve. Because you're an entrepreneur, you'll always say that I'll fix it, it'll get better. It never gets better. So for example, if sales is a challenge and you're using a sales team, then if you say, okay, I'm not able to solve this at 50 people, but I'll solve it at 500, it's never going to happen. If you cannot fix it at 50, don't go to 500. My previous venture was a food tech where the day I decided to shut down the business was when I had the most number of orders, when I figured out there is no way to solve this problem. And if I can't solve this at 200 orders, there's no way I can solve this at 10,000. So something which is failing, pay a lot of attention to it and honestly assess whether you think you can fix that problem or not. Or is there a way to maneuver yourself away from that problem, either using automation or using something else which gets you out of that crux? The third piece, which honestly I think we always under-leverage, is the whole point around brand and the necessity to build out a brand even in early days. I think is very critical. Vishy and I are super analytical people, and we believe in numbers, we believe in tracking and a method to the madness. Now, invariably, that forced us to put a lot more money and energy into digital marketing over building a brand, because brand is something which is intangible, which is very hard to measure what happens out of it. Whereas in digital marketing, it's very easy for me to say, okay, fine, I put a rupee in, I got back 3 rupees, my ROAS is brilliant. But that's the slippery slope. In the case of brand, you cannot measure it, but it just significantly accelerates over time. So when you're looking at your marketing budget, even in early stages, not more than 30-40% of your budget has to go towards digital marketing. Despite the fact that it's measurable, there are ridiculous number of tools available and so on, it still does not create that brand impression which a brand and the communication does. The last one is back yourself as founders more, because in a lot of times you understand the situation much better than most of others. So be it your board or your investors, back yourself and say, we can grow to the next point, but beyond that, we cannot scale this model. So we have to pivot a little bit. And we need to move the distribution model from A to B. It's going to take us a little bit of energy. This is not the right time to be doing it. We may need to go for one more fundraise, blah, blah, blah. but we still need to do it. The moment you start getting onto the treadmill of saying, I have a 10% growth number, I have to somehow achieve that number, and you keep running towards that race, it becomes very hard to stop and self-assess. Now, in our case, COVID actually gave us that opportunity. When COVID stopped the business, we could literally halt and look at what are we doing? Do we have a fundamentally sustainable business? If not, what does a sustainable business look like and how do we start moving towards that? Now, in the treadmill, that's very hard to assess, but I think this is very critical for founders to do because everybody else is just taking your cue. They're literally taking your words, and if you say, okay, fine, we can go to the moon, they'll follow you. That is a very critical piece for a founder to assess and say, do I have the right vehicle? And do I need to fix the vehicle before I get into the air? Because you can't constantly go into the air, go for a certain period of time, and then say, come back, I will fix it. As a founder, you need to back yourself to do that.